At the University of Toledo, we are surrounded by experts. And we tap into those experts here on Rocket Talk.
Welcome to a special edition of Rocket Talk. I wanted to bring in an expert on Eastern Europe for what's happening in Ukraine. Now, it's important to note we're recording this on Monday to air Friday, realizing that this situation is rapidly evolving and a lot can happen in just a few days. Barry Jackisch is a visiting associate professor here at the University of Toledo. He is a historian of modern Central and Eastern Europe with research and a book on democracy, fascism, and communism. He teaches courses in modern German and Russian history and war. Truly the perfect guest for this topic because you are so familiar with this region and the history in that region. So in the media, lots of talk about this war. What do you believe we should be talking about? Maybe something that doesn't make a flashy headline, but something really important for the American people to know.
Well, I think as I've mentioned before, having studied and taught modern European history for many years, I'm still somewhat in a state of shock that we're actually having this discussion, that the two largest states in Europe, namely Russia and Ukraine, are now in a state of war, even though Russia refuses to acknowledge the use of that word. And I think as everyone looks on and sees these horrors unfold in front of their eyes on a daily basis, I think a lot of people are wondering, how will this end? And so I think one of the things that we have not spoken as much about, or we haven't seen covered in the news as much, is this very question. In other words, trying to speculate what might happen. And I wish I had a more positive answer to what that might be, but I think to answer your question directly, which is what are we not talking about, I would direct your viewers to the Russian siege and the attack on the city of Grozny, which happened in 1999 and 2000. And then also the way that the Russian military, especially the Russian Air Force, behaved in Syria, especially with the Syrian city of Aleppo. And the reason that I mention those two examples, I think many people look at this and they say, I cannot believe that, and then fill in the blank, right? I cannot believe that Vladimir Putin or the Russian military would bomb hospitals. I cannot believe that if the Russians lay siege to the city, the capital of Ukraine, of Kyiv, that there would be an outright destruction of civilian housing, of hospitals, of schools. And yet, the very simple answer to that is you should believe it, because all you have to do is look at earlier examples where Vladimir Putin and the Russian military have done exactly that. Grozny is one example, and Aleppo in Syria is a more recent example. So I think when we watch this, we need to be appropriately cautious in believing that there will be a positive outcome here, because Vladimir Putin in many ways has gone all in. And I think the only way this can be resolved successfully for him is to remove the government, the current government that's in Ukraine. And to do that, by all accounts, it will require a siege and direct conquest of the capital of Kyiv. And that could be a very bloody thing indeed.
I think seeing these images coming from the area, people are just horrified. A lot of people are asking, why isn't the U.S. doing more?
That is one of the very difficult things as any kind of person that has a sense of concern for their fellow human beings. I mean, you see some of these, just this morning they reported that one of the pregnant women that was at the hospital that was bombed several days ago, she and her baby died. And we see all sorts of scenes. One of the ones that really struck me was a 6-year-old girl in a subway under attack, desperately holding on to her puppy. And you see these kinds of scenes and they're heartrending and they're terrible. And so one of our first responses is to think we're one of the most powerful countries in the world militarily in terms of our influence. Why can't we stop this? No. And there's a sense of powerlessness in some ways. The problem is one of the most frequently discussed options, aside from the suite of sanctions that we've already imposed on Russia, which are, I should say, significant, but you have to ask, what can you do militarily? And the very simple answer to that question is very little, unless you want to precipitate World War III. And I think President Biden has made that as clear as he can make it. There's no point in misleading the American people about this. If we were to begin some sort of no-fly zone, as you've heard discussed, in any part of Ukraine, we've heard discussions of over the entire country for NATO jets, or even over just the western part of Ukraine, that would directly place NATO aircraft on a collision course with Russian aircraft. And once a shoot down happens, it's impossible to predict the way that might turn out. And so short of the very aggressive military sanctions, and there are a few remaining options that we and our allies, especially in Europe, have not pursued, a military solution where NATO becomes directly involved in this, I think, is unwise at this point, as difficult as it is to see those terrible images because of how quickly this could accelerate.
So the other options are more sanctions?
Well, one of the big, kind of the elephant in the room is, many of your viewers will remember that President Biden came out several days ago and said that we are, in addition to all of our other sanctions, we are now directly refusing to import any further Russian oil and gas. For all of your viewers not familiar with this, Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas, and it is the second largest exporter of oil. Most of the time we think of oil-producing countries and we think of Saudi Arabia or Iran or Venezuela. Russia is one of the world's biggest exporter of petroleum products. And in that regard, this was an important move on the part of the US president, but it is largely symbolic in that the US maybe at most imports 9 or 10% of its domestic consumption in oil from Russian sources. That is a very different scenario in Western Europe. Germany, for example, and some of your viewers might recall the debate about the so-called Nord Stream pipeline 2, which has been very controversial. Germany decided not to hook that up to provide natural gas directly from Russia. So much of Western Europe is heavily reliant on Russian, especially natural gas. Germany gets almost 60% of its oil and gas from Russia still, even today. And so when I say the elephant in the room, one of the additional steps that could be taken would be to push and secure Western European support for also banning any future Russian and oil gas imports. The problem is, if that happens for a very, very densely populated continent like Europe, with countries like Germany and others that are heavily reliant on fuel resources from Russia, where will that be made up? Who will take up all of the slack that will certainly happen as a result of such a ban? So there are steps that can still be taken. The problem is there are consequences to doing that. So to summarize, many people want to do more. We are in some ways screaming out and we say, how can this be happening? How can we see this on television? The problem is we run into the very difficult real world consequences of either military action or additional sanctions. And sadly, Vladimir Putin realizes that.
So, Doctor, you touched on it a lot. You know, we're already paying more at the pump, but how else might this war impact the average person watching this in Toledo or Temperance?
Well, I think to be sure, one of the things that we've seen, I think in polls have come out very recently that Americans have said they are willing to pay more at the pump, at least now, if they know that that means we can keep sanctions pressure on Russia. So there are still at least poll support for that linkage. I think one of the bigger issues that we might end up seeing is, as of this morning, roughly 2.7 million Ukrainians are now refugees. And the country of Poland, which has taken on the most Ukrainian refugees, has basically said we can't take any more. And so one of the questions that now may come up, for example, some of your viewers may have seen recently the United States has taken in several thousand Afghan refugees after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We're talking now 2, 3, maybe 4 million Ukrainians who might be looking to get out. So one of the things in the near term might well be US communities considering at least hosting for indeterminate amount of time Ukrainian refugees, and that may be something we're hearing about more in the weeks and months to come.
This may be a really tough question, but what do you think's going on in Putin's head? I mean, what's the game plan here, you know?
So I'll tell you a very, I know we don't have a lot of time, I'll tell you a very interesting story. So Putin's entire life is extremely scripted. He, like many other dictators, tries to control what people say about him and what kind of public image he expresses. And so when that same person who tries to control his public image very much likes to repeat a particular story, that story should maybe give us some insight into his thinking. One of Putin's stories that he likes to tell or have told about him is about his youth growing up in a rundown apartment building in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad at the time. And he was a very small child, and he and his friends used to run around in the hallways with sticks, and they would chase down rats. And at one point he wanted to show off because he was the smallest among the group, and he wanted to prove that he was the toughest. So he found the biggest rat, cornered that rat, and as he's getting ready to hit the rat with the stick, the rat turns on him and jumps on him, and he runs off. And so Putin says, I learned two things. Number one, never allow yourself to be cornered. And number two, always be the aggressor in any circumstance, so this can't happen again. If we want to know about Putin's mind, I think that story tells us something very valuable.
What a way to wrap this up. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insight. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.